Hello, friends, and welcome to another episode of the Liberty Weekly podcast. I'm your host, as always, Patrick McFarland. Show notes for this one may be found at libertyweekly.net/204. And the title of this episode is Holographic Apocalypse, Project Blue Beam. And I think you guys are really going to enjoy this one. It's a topic that I really don't cover on the podcast, which is aliens and UFOs. And I just thought I'd have a little fun with something that really kind of piqued my interest lately. And so before we get into that, I want to remind everyone that this show is a part of the Libertarian Institute at libertarianinstitute.org. It is featured there alongside with other fine podcasts such as Conflicts of Interest with Kyle Anzalone and Connor Freeman, Don't Tread on Anyone with Keith Knight, and Year Zero with Tommy Salmons, as well as the Scott Horton Show. Scott is our director over at the Libertarian Institute there, alongside with a whole bunch of awesome writers. And I think you guys should really keep your eyes on the Institute because we're starting to put out a lot of content, a lot of specialty content. And I'm just really excited for the team that we have assembled there. So head on over there. All right. So to dive into this whole episode, I've been doing a lot of kind of scattered research, and I haven't really woven together like a complete narrative of like, oh, I want to start with this thing first and then move to that thing. So apologies if it seems a little disjointed, but I've never covered UFOs on this show, and I have a tangential interest in the UFO phenomenon. And I think primarily because the UFO phenomenon seems very intimately related with the whole United States security state situation, because these intelligence agencies have been so woven into the whole UFO narrative and the UFO mythology, and all of it going back to like Roswell, that type of situation. And like, it seems really linked to me with the whole Manhattan Project and this whole theory being that, well, once we started detonating nuclear bombs, then all of a sudden this whole UFO situation began in earnest. Although, of course, there have been what have been called UFO sightings for centuries, going back millennia. If you get into the whole, the History Channel kind of Ancient Aliens thing, which I don't necessarily subscribe to, although at one point I did back when I was in undergrad, as I think a lot of people were. But it seems like the UFO situation is pretty intimately tied to the starting of the atomic age. And all of a sudden you have Roswell and you have the intelligence community really becoming intimately involved. And so it's really this interesting kind of crossroads, specifically with a figure that I really, really enjoy listening to. And when I do UFO stuff, my main guy that I listen to is Richard Dolan, who is a guy who has written like maybe some of the most important UFO historical accounts, history books on the UFO phenomenon. And incidentally, he is someone who has been really, really, really good on COVID and really good on false flag operations. And I think he's written some books on false flags, this phenomenon. But he seems to be someone who's on the side of liberty and freedom, but he is like the most rational person that I think I've met I haven't met him, but that I've observed who's been in the UFO situation. And so I think I've mentioned him a couple times on this show, but I wanted to kind of introduce people to his work. He is a very firm believer in the UFO situation, and some of the weirder stuff that I think that he kind of subscribed to is this idea of remote viewing, which I mean, the CIA thought it was important enough to look into. And I think that the Russians were looking into it too. But other than that, I've found a lot of his reasoning and his stuff to be very based in fact, or at least things that he's been able to observe and document. So I thought that he did this episode, and I'm going to frame this whole Project Bluebeam situation with this initial clip here. But I don't want to bury the lead. Project Bluebeam is this idea that the ultimate goal of NASA is to fake an alien invasion or to fake the second coming of Christ. And I mean, like, just initially, I'm sure people watching this are like, holy shit, like, that's really out there. Yeah, I know. I found it to be interesting. We're gonna get into James Corbett's work to see like Is there any kind of real evidence for this? Spoiler alert, no, there isn't. But there are circumstantial things that I think are interesting. So let's go on over to Richard Dolan and kind of get his introduction to the whole the idea of the U.S. security state being tied into the UFO phenomenon.
When I think about the long history of UFOs and the long period of time that I personally have been engaged in it, I would say it's fair to say that the time we're living in right now is unlike anything we've ever seen. For years and years and for decades, researchers of UFOs faced a wall of denial and ridicule any single time they ever broached this topic in public. So during the 1950s, during the 1960s, and the 70s, and the 80s, and the 90s, and well into our current century, this was the rule. Anyone who did the slightest work on this subject, and admittedly, there weren't really that many ever over much of a period of time, but those people did know that the official word from the government was a complete and total lie. Now, how did we know this? We knew it from the diligence of a few people who took the time to read the reports, to interview countless witnesses of this phenomenon, and even to speak to military insiders who often privately and anonymously, but nevertheless recounted their own amazing and sometimes harrowing encounters with UFOs. And a good portion of those inside accounts were completely corroborated and validated by subsequent research. And during the late 1970s, we began to be able to get some declassified military documents through FOIA. And at that point, it was case closed. We knew, like, it became a case of the obvious staring us right in the face. UFOs were real, despite whatever denial the government and the military had to say about it. By the way, before I go any further, I just want to remind you, if you like what I do here, I often forget to say this, gently press that like button if you want to just help me out with the algos. And if you actually like what I do on this channel, you can always consider subscribing and clicking on notifications. After all, it's free. You don't want to miss out on new information. Okay, done with that. Anyway, to maintain that denial. Well, first of all, there was tremendous support from the media establishment, from the academic establishment, and certainly from politicians. All three of those institutions, media, academia, and the political institutions, they were and they remain deeply compromised by the military and the intelligence community. We know about all this. We know about the infamous Operation Mockingbird, in which the CIA explicitly had deep relationships with hundreds of major American journalists. Could be way more than even hundreds. 400 was a number that Carl Bernstein came up with in the late 1970s. Was it more? I'm going to guess it was probably more. But anyway, it was a huge thing. And we also know about the revolving door between the intelligence community and America's elite universities. And of course, how so many, if not all, politicians are just bought and paid for, as well as blackmailed. So for years and years, those groups were perfectly willing to be bootlickers to the select group of secret keepers engaged in UFO disinformation. And that is a total denial of the UFO reality. Now, one thing we've been able to learn while examining that history is that there have always been factions from within that world. That is the world of military and intelligence personnel who have disagreed with the emphasis on total secrecy and denial. And I would just say that it's good to remember that the intelligence community it's not a monolith. It's much more of a labyrinth, and it's got groups that have competing interests, and it's got a history of disagreement on a lot of important things. Always has. It's never been unified. It's never been monolithic. So during the 1950s, for instance, UFO researcher Donald Keyhoe had a lot to say about this. Keyhoe was a retired Marine Corps major who had some friends in some high places, including the one-time director of the CIA that he was a classmate at Annapolis with back, many years before. Anyway, Keyhoe wrote quite extensively about how the so-called secrecy group, as he often called them, was countered by other groups, or sometimes one, sometimes multiple groups within the Air Force and also other military services like the Navy, by those individuals who believe in greater openness on UFOs. This was an ongoing struggle. And if you read Kehoe's books carefully, and not just Kehoe, but read even Report on Unidentified Flying Objects by Edward Ruppelt. But what you can, if you read it carefully, you can pick out a very interesting dynamic that was at play. Now, it's true that the side of secrecy consistently won those battles, but there were definite moments in which the people on the other side were able to make their own waves and cause a threat to the overall policy. It happened on more than one occasion. Now, of course, this sort of thing has never been exclusive to the subject of UFOs. I mean, during the 1970s, the CIA had whistleblowers like Victor Marchetti and Philip Agee, who wrote about many of the misdeeds of that agency. They got a lot of trouble for it, by the way, and a lot of hassle accrued to them over that. But it was a huge controversy at the time. More recently, in our own century, we've learned of intelligence community whistleblowers like William Binney and Edward Snowden, obviously. There have been many others. They're just the best known of them. The point, once again, is that the intelligence community is not a monolith. It's too big for that. It's too big. There are always going to be different perspectives from within it. I can't tell you how many times I've spoken with someone from within the military or within the intelligence community about the subject of UFOs. It's happened more than once. And a typical attitude that I get is something like, yes, I support the idea of getting the truth out, but my hands are tied. Can't do anything about it. And that is probably the single most typical response that I get from anyone in that world who knows anything about this subject. They've all got their jobs to do. They've all taken their security oaths. And some of them would be in serious hot water if they were to break those oaths.
Okay, so there we have Richard Dolan talking about, he's talking about the video that I took that clip from is called, Is Disclosure a PSYOP? And so at the beginning of the video, he sets up everything with how the intelligence agencies have been related to the UFO question. And he goes on to talk about To the Stars Academy, which is was a bizarre thing that happened a couple of years ago where a bunch of spooks from the intelligence agencies got together with Tom DeLonge, of all people, from Blink-182. He's, the former lead singer of Blink-182. I love Blink-182, by the way. And Tom's always been into aliens. They're going back to some of their first albums. Do Aliens Exist was one of their really popular songs, one of my favorites. But all of a sudden, a couple of years ago, maybe 4 years ago, Tom DeLonge became involved with To the Stars Academy, which was like a disclosure movement full of spooks talking about how releasing new alien videos and pretty much preparing, seemingly in a weird way, preparing mankind for disclosure. And it was really, really strange. But then... and really the reason why I made this video in the first place is because just last year, so July 4th, 2021, July 4th is not a coincidence why they picked that date, by the way. This guy named Stephen Greer, and some of you may be familiar with him if you're in the UFO space. He released this video on YouTube called The Cosmic Hoax in Expose. And I thought it was really, really strange because in this documentary, Stephen Greer touches on Project Bluebeam. That's kind of what the whole thing is about. And we're going to get into the etymology of Project Bluebeam in a second. But basically, this French-Canadian journalist came up with this idea. He wrote an essay about it in the 90s called Project Bluebeam. And we'll kind of take a look at that after we get into what Stephen Greer is, who he is, and the idea he's presenting, and how he sets it out. So it's really strange because this guy, Stephen Greer, was famously the figurehead of this whole 2001. In 2001, there was a conference shortly before 9/11 happened where Stephen Greer got a whole bunch of spooks together from the intelligence communities, and all of them got together in this panel, and they gave their basically testimony saying this is the evidence that there are aliens out there and that they're real, and I've seen them and witnessed them in my career of being a spook, for whatever that's worth. But you've already seen Richard Dolan just talk about the interrelationship between the intelligence communities, and I don't need to tell you that. Everyone knows about it. So Stephen Greer, in his own words, he's going to tell you about who he is and what he's done. So let's get that little bit right here.
I provided briefings for 4 presidents, foreign heads of state, generals, and a sitting CIA director who later betrayed me. I've seen lives destroyed.
William Colby has been missing since April 27th. His canoe was found washed up on the banks of the Wicomico River.
Friends murdered. Unthinkable evil unleashed on our planet. All to protect this illegal and immoral secrecy. Heads of state from around the world come to me, a retired medical doctor, to get the truth about this phenomenon. And sadly, they don't have the power to do much about it once they know the truth. In 2001, I brought together 20 senior military, intelligence, and aerospace whistleblowers at the National Press Club in Washington, D.C., for a press conference that would change the world forever. The men and women who are on this stage and the some 350 additional military intelligence witnesses to the so-called UFO matter and extraterrestrial intelligence can prove and will prove that we are not alone. This marked the public debut of the Disclosure Project and the launch of the global disclosure movement to end UFO secrecy and disclose technologies that would end poverty, climate change, and the use of fossil fuels overnight and transform every aspect of life on Earth.
So you can take that from Stephen Greer's mouth himself from that documentary, The Cosmic Hoax. But if you just go on YouTube, you can also find a whole bunch of interviews that he's done with a bunch of people. I don't know if he's been on Rogan, but he's been on with Logan Paul. He's been on with weirdly Danica Patrick and Demi Lovato. He's been on Fox News. So he's made the rounds in the media sphere. And of course, if you type anything podcast related with aliens, you'll get Joe Rogan and stuff. And I think Joe Rogan has talked about him a little bit on the show. But yeah, so you can see that he's made the rounds. He claims that he's briefed presidents on these issues. He claims a whole bunch of crazy, wild things. But more specifically, we'll see that in his documentary, The Cosmic Hoax, he makes some pretty bold claims, and from a source that would seem to be credible, and a source that also did testify in that 2001 hearing about aliens. And this bold claim is very, very similar to what the claim is in the original Project Bluebeam.
One of the biggest bombshells at that 2001 press conference was the testimony of Carol Rosin, an aerospace executive who worked beside Wernher von Braun, the Nazi rocket scientist who came to America after World War II to work for NASA. Carol received his deathbed confession, a testimony so terrifying that we spent the last 20 years trying to warn about it.
Now, here was von Braun sitting at a desk when I first met him, explaining to me that he was told he only had 3 to 6 weeks to live, but that he was going to stay alive long enough to teach me what the real game is that's going on. And it started out when I was in the industry, the Russians were the threat. We had to build space-based weapons against the Russians. And then third world countries called nations of concern at that time. And then the asteroid threat, which I thought was kind of comical that we could just put weapons up there to shoot down or steer an asteroid. And then it leads to the last card.
And then he would repeat to me over and over, and the last card, the last card, the last card would be the extraterrestrial threat.
He explained to me that there was a moment when we were going to be told that the extraterrestrial beings, that their craft were a threat, and they were not.
These craft that have come here are now not UFOs, they're identified flying objects, and we know that they have beings in them. And we have witnesses here who have told you that they can shut down our missile silos. They can stop a rocket going into space that's a test. We have witnesses here who have worked in the classified departments who have the courage to come forward here. to support what Werner von Braun told me back in 1974 to 77.
At the end, I said, and it's all a lie. Well, it's still all a lie.
The ultimate dream of the dialectical war machine, the military-industrial complex, is to have this war with a potential extraterrestrial civilization. It's their dream of all times. You know, you can roll into place all the kind of strictures of a national security state. You can spend literally trillions of dollars a year on massive military equipment, super high-tech equipment, et cetera. And so that it's logical that they would use that as an excuse. And we do know from repeated examples of it that the utilization of a false flag operation to initiate a war goes on over and over and over again. Our human family does that. The nation states do that. Hitler has done it. They dress up troops looking like some other neutral country they want to invade and have their own troops dress up like them and pretend they've assaulted somebody, and they rush in and attack that country. You know, it's gone on and on.
For a complete fascist takeover, the men behind the curtain will have to play their final card, a cosmic 9/11.
This temptation to generate a false flag attack on the part of some extraterrestrial civilization, you know, you even hear people like Ronald Reagan make reference to it.
Perhaps we need some outside universal threat to make us recognize this common bound. I occasionally think how quickly our differences worldwide would vanish if we were facing an alien threat from outside this world.
Wouldn't it be clear if we all of a sudden found ourselves being attacked by an extraterrestrial civilization? We'd finally all come together. Wouldn't that be really lovely? Well, it's not really lovely for the industrial state. They don't want to lose their other enemies first. They want to use up all that before they go to that extreme.
The last card was the most profound experience I had in my whole life. And I accepted the mission. And until Stephen Greer picked me up and talked me into going to the Disclosure Project, when I had just about given up, that's when I saw that there were other witnesses to what's going on, to the truth, to the facts.
When she told me what Werner von Braun had said, it didn't surprise me, because I had previously met with a number of people in the defense industry and in the intelligence community who had already told me that there was such a plan and that it could be actuated at any moment. And that was one of the long-term agendas, was keep the technologies away so we can maintain our industrial base of fossil fuel and all this. When we're ready to pull the trigger on releasing this information, spin it in the direction that benefits the foxes guarding the henhouse, the people holding these secrets. But it was interesting to hear that all the way back in the early 70s that he had been warning her about this. And we know that those systems were developed in the late 40s and 50s.
Alrighty, bam, there you have it. So that's all of it laid out, Dr. Stephen Greer in The Cosmic Hoax. And it's just really interesting because this would all seem like really red meat for people who are in the conspiracy community, people who are into, like 9/11 truth movements. Obviously, false flags are a real thing. It's something that we've covered here on this show. And people who are anti-war or people who are against American imperialism or anything like that, seems like this would be really plausible, right? War is the health of the state. We would put everything together and they're really lining everything up for a fake alien invasion. And then, people like Ronald Reagan have said this. People like Paul Krugman have said this, and we'll kind of get into that a little bit with James Corbett's piece on the same topic. So yeah, it seems like this would be something that's plausible, and I'm sure, when I saw this, of course, it piqued my interest enough to want to look into it a bit more and to really kind of explore this topic. And let's see how much we can really kind of verify here. So Carol Rosin, for those of you just watching the video version, listening to the audio version, you didn't really get to see, who this lady is. She has some crazy hair, man. Carol Rosin is an award-winning, this is from her website, peaceandspace.com. She's an award-winning educator, child psychologist, futurist, international speaker, author, military strategist, and space and missile defense consultant. So she's a spook. She's a founder of the Institute for Security and Cooperation in Outer Space. She's the president of the Peace and Emergency Action Coalition for Earth. She's a World Peace Ambassador for the International Association of Educators for World Peace. So, how many hats does she wear, dude? And how did she end up with Wernher von Braun? So, let's see. It says here she's an educator, perhaps best known as the original political architect of the movement to stop the Strategic Defense Initiative and anti-satellite weapons. She became the first woman executive in the aerospace industry, a corporate manager at Fairchild Industries, a U.S. aerospace company where she was also spokesperson for the late Dr. Wernher von Braun, known in the U.S. as the father of rocketry. With von Braun, Carol invented and coordinated the award-winning It's Your Turn educational and film program to motivate youth, women, and minorities in fields of science and technology so they could help achieve world peace and train for new jobs and careers in service in every field with an emphasis on health and a clean and safe environment for all. Their program won various awards, including the Aviation Writers Award, the Science Teachers Gold Medal, and others. Carol helped set up the ATS-6 satellite educational and medical training programs across the U.S. and Appalachia, Rocky Mountains, Alaska, and India, including the first national and international two-way audiovisual satellite education programs in over 20 countries, including 5,000 villages in India. After leaving Fairchild after the death of von Braun, Carol became the national chancellor of the International Association of Educators for World Peace, founded by Dr. Charles Mercica, and sorry, name hard to pronounce, in consultative status with the UN Economic and Social Council. After bringing several experts to the UN's second special session of the peaceful uses and exploration of outer space in Vienna, Austria, Carol founded the Institute for Security and Cooperation in Outer Space. So, there's a lot more to her. She's a University of Delaware alumnus. There's a lot more to her biography here, and I'm not going to go through everything. So you can see that she, at least her page on peaceandspace.com corroborates a lot of that information we see in the documentary. There's the same picture of her with Dr. Wernher von Braun. She was his spokesperson, according to this. So it seems like it would be compelling, right? We have these insiders coming forward, making these claims about Dr. Wernher von Braun and the NASA program and all this stuff. But this is totally legit, right? Right? This is totally legit. How much can you trust people in the intelligence communities? And you see you see Richard Dolan at the beginning of this saying that the intelligence communities all have these it's more like a labyrinth, right? And at the beginning of this Cosmic Hoax documentary, you see, I didn't include this, but you see Stephen Greer kind of taking a shot at To the Stars Academy, taking a shot at a lot of the spooks who were into the Stars Academy, maybe because they weren't on his side of this. Maybe this is just an internal squabble that he's taking a shot at them, saying, no, what they're doing here is that they're setting up aliens as being this existential threat, that there's UFOs flying all over our military facilities, and this is really dangerous. And there's a shot of Tucker Carlson with like the Tic Tac video when the Navy disclosure UFO videos came out in 2018. And Stephen Greer saying, no, that's wrong. They're setting it up for an alien invasion, and that's what's going to happen. That's the end game. And then he brings on these people that he's, rubbed shoulders with that are maybe his spooks on his side of it. And we'll get into more into that in a second, very quickly here, actually. But he brings on those people so don't trust those spooks, trust these spooks. They're coming forward. They're insiders with this knowledge. That's what we should do. Okay, so here is the 2015 episode of the Corbett Report, How to Fake an Alien Invasion. And when I saw the Stephen Greer documentary, The Cosmic Hoax, I thought of this episode of the Corbett Report immediately because I had seen it, a few years ago when I started down this libertarian kind of independent media pathway and started my podcast. But Corbett talks in this episode about how this idea of an alien invasion and this idea of hostile alien civilizations attacking the Earth has been put into popular culture by the mainstream media, by the intelligence communities, and in popular culture, and that it's come up again and again and again and again. And I think Corbett is doing much the same thing in his episode that I'm doing in mine, is that not necessarily warning that there's going to be for sure a fake alien invasion that's going to bring about the New World Order, but merely exploring why this idea has been placed in the public consciousness, because it has. And he talks in here about how, we see in popular culture over and over again this idea of an alien invasion and the world uniting to repel that invasion. We've had people talk about it like Ronald Reagan, like Paul Krugman, and like Bill Clinton. He has in here a segment about Bill Clinton talking about it on Jimmy Kimmel in Alien Invasion. Dr. Miko Kaku has talked about how to survive an alien invasion. The Vatican, the Vatican has talked about it with NASA, which is really interesting. The UN appoints an ambassador for aliens. And so it's really just a strange thing. We have the movie Independence Day being a huge movie that, incidentally, I really like that movie. As a 90s kid, of course, we grew up with it. But Bill Clinton talking about the coming fake alien invasion. So all these things are coming up in the popular conscience, and it's worth investigating. Corbett, he concludes, now I'm not necessarily saying that there's going to be a staged alien invasion tomorrow and that we should all be concentrating on this, nor am I saying that there's no such thing as alien life in the universe. Again, I'll let you guys, your grown-up boys and girls out there, I'm sure you can decide for yourselves on things like that, but we should know that there is a coordinated plan or an agenda in place to capitalize on such things as fake alien invasions that is being funded and promoted by the financial power elite at the top of the pyramid, and is being promoted and pushed out into the cultural sphere by the politicians and economists and the Vatican and the UN, and then underneath them the culture creators in the entertainment industry, to prepare the public for such a possibility, and we should be on guard against such manipulations. And so where this comes into the Dr. Stephen Greer documentary is the Rockefeller connection. And Corbett talks about that as well. So there is a Rockefeller connection here. If you recall the War of the Worlds broadcast, this was like a defining event where the idea of an alien invasion really entered the public consciousness with the H.G. Wells short story and Orson Welles reading it on the radio, and there being like a public panic that ensued. And there was a Rockefeller study that took place on the reaction in that panic broadcast. So then Corbett goes on and finds even more connections between Lawrence Rockefeller, specifically with the UFO phenomenon.
So you might fruitfully ask, are there any other connections between Rockefellers and this idea of faking an alien invasion or an alien presence of some sort? And the answer is yes. Yes, there is such evidence.
Mr. Rockefeller backed many UFO-related projects in the period between the late 80s and 2000. But for the purpose of this hearing, we will concentrate on his political initiatives in these areas. Lawrence Rockefeller's first forays into ufology started sometime in the late 80s through Dr. Cecil B. Scott Jones, a parapsychologist and former U.S. Navy commander who had worked as naval attaché in Asia and at the Naval Scientific and Technical Intelligence Center. Between 1985 and 1991, Jones was special assistant to Senator Claiborne Pell, the powerful Rhode Island Democrat chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, who was deeply interested in parapsychology and who probably many of you met personally. Senator Pell was also friends with Lawrence Rockefeller, and both served on the board of the Human Potential Foundation, a small think tank launched in 1989 in Vienna, Virginia by Jones to conduct, quote, research into all conditions of humankind, physiological, psychological, and spiritual. Many of the papers released by the White House OSTP come from Scott Jones, who knew Dr. John Gibbons, a physicist who worked for many years as director of the Office of Technology Assessment for the U.S. Congress, and was appointed in 1993 by the Clinton administration to direct the OSTP. What was the exact turning point of Lawrence Rockefeller's evolution from a general interest in consciousness studies into the specific area of UFOs and extraterrestrial intelligence is still unclear. But the end of the Cold War and the arrival in Washington of a younger generation represented by Bill and Hillary Clinton are key factors. He felt the time was ripe for a new and fresh approach into an area that had been previously dominated by a Cold War mentality. Rockefeller recruited for these efforts a longtime associate, Henry L. Diamond, an environmental attorney from Washington, D.C., whose links to the family went all the way back to the 1960s, when he worked with Lawrence in his conservation activities. Diamond also knew John Gibbons, and so he was the right person to make the first contact with the OSTP chief when he sent a memorandum on March 29, 1993, requesting a meeting. And I'm quoting now the first paragraph. Lawrence S. Rockefeller, who is a leading U.S. conservationist, businessman, and philanthropist, is anxious to have a brief meeting with Dr. Gibbons to discuss the potential availability of government information about unidentified flying objects and extraterrestrial life. As one who has had a long-time interest in environmental and spiritual issues, Mr. Rockefeller, with other leading citizens, is planning to make an approach to President Clinton on this subject.
I invite all of the political media, all media in general, but certainly the political media, to look at the Rockefeller Initiative. It is one of the great stories in American history. It's one of the great political stories, certainly of this or any other time. It is filled with amazing people who are still around and still very powerful. At the time that Rockefeller approached, through his attorney, President Clinton, Clinton's one of his very key advisors was John Podesta. The chief of staff at the time was Leon Panetta. The wife of the president at the time was Hillary Clinton. A good friend of the family at the time, soon to be Clinton's Secretary of Energy, was Bill Richardson. And this event went on, or this initiative went on for 6 years. The press completely ignored it, as if, what's the news there? It's just a billionaire Rockefeller trying to get the president to release all the files on this phenomena, possibly put a letter into every newspaper in the country and release, and the truth embargo. There's no news there.
Now, for those of you not immersed in the topic of the disclosure movement, you may not be familiar with some of these names and faces, but some of the main ones to take note of are, of course, Dr. Stephen Bassett, who founded and runs something called the Paradigm Research Group at paradigmresearchgroup.org. He defines himself as a political activist, lobbyist, commentator, the executive director of Paradigm Research Group and the Extraterrestrial Phenomena Political Action Committee, and executive producer of the X Conference, the Citizen Hearing on Disclosure, and the Congressional Hearing Initiative. And Dr. Stephen Greer, who runs something called the Disclosure Project, and he describes himself as the father of the disclosure movement and the person who presided over the groundbreaking National Press Club disclosure event in May of 2001. So these are some of the biggest names, if not the biggest names, in this disclosure movement. And, well, they don't really make a secret of the fact that the Rockefellers are, or specifically Lawrence Rockefeller, was a big help in getting this movement launched back in the mid-1990s. And again, we can document this.
Okay, so already we have Stephen Greer's name coming up, and now you can see where this all kind of ties together and why this really piqued my interest, because Stephen Greer is mentioned by name, and he has a lot of sway in the UFO community, and he seems pretty out there, pretty nutso to me. I mean, just my initial impressions. He's a weird-looking guy. He pops up all over the place. He has these Rockefeller connections. And some of the things he does is hard to believe. Like if you were watching the video version of this episode, in the beginning, when I played the clips from his documentary, you see the banner at the bottom saying like, contact extraterrestrials today, just download this app. And it just seems, and that's kind of where the serious, like the end of the cosmic hoax they have an advertisement for this like new agey app that you can download, and you can, with other people, do these meditation exercises where you contact extraterrestrials and stuff like that. That just seems kind of bananas. But, oh, well, look at this. Stephen Greer, Clinton Digital Library. Here's a FOIA request documenting the fact that Stephen Greer did talk to Bill Clinton. Like he says, like, I briefed presidents. So you can see here that if you do a FOIA request for phone calls between Bill Clinton and Stephen Greer, there's stuff there. Okay. And of course there's that huge conference that he had in 2001. So it would be if it was just some guy in a basement, like making these wild, outlandish claims, but he obviously has funding. He obviously shows up in popular media. He's been on Fox. Like, I mean, for the people who just aren't familiar with this guy, like he has some connections. And like Corbett said, there is proof that Greer has been involved with the Rockefellers. And in fact, he said it himself.
A group gathering here in Washington to talk about their UFO sightings, but this apparently is no crackpot convention. Former high-level government and military officials are among those sharing what they've seen in the skies.
Now, a group of scientists, former Air Force and FAA officials, is lending its voice to the argument that we are not alone. Dr. Stephen Greer heads up the Disclosure Project, a group that compiles information from people who say they've encountered extraterrestrial forms of life.
We can establish through this testimony that these objects of extraterrestrial origin have been tracked on radar going thousands of miles per hour, stopping and making right-hand turns.
Since 1993, Dr. Greer says he has videotaped testimony.
When I put these briefings together, Lawrence Rockefeller hosted the Clintons at his ranch. One of the old Rockefeller guys, and he wanted the truth out, but his brother David Rockefeller, Chase Manhattan Bank, doesn't. And Lawrence was the philosopher of the family. He went to Princeton with McDonald, old man McDonald of McDonnell Douglas Aerospace. And Lawrence really did want to get this fixed, but he got surrounded by people from the CIA that took all of his money and flushed it down the toilet. But when he was hosting the Clintons at his ranch, and he was going through all these materials that we had put together, Hillary Clinton stood up and said, "Stop. We don't want to hear any more. This is too dangerous." And that was the end of that. So by 1998, I had concluded that neither the Congress nor the President nor the United Nations, and I had met with the Boutros-Ghali family, the UN Secretary General, were going to stick their necks out on this. It was too hot to handle. Therefore, we did the Disclosure Project.
I want to talk about UFOs, popular culture, and the quest for world government. It's a very paradigm-shifting path to power. Now, Lawrence Rockefeller is on record as having had meetings circa 1993 with Hillary Clinton and a number of advisors during his efforts to push the Disclosure Project, which he had funded and backed through the likes of figures like Stephen Greer, who brought forward government and military experts who had knowledge and were pushing for official declassification of any secrets the government might have on extraterrestrial life, UFO crashes, and anything else that fits the bill.
Lawrence Rockefeller? Did it have something to do with the Disclosure Project? Stephen Greer? Because they were all at the same meeting.
What meeting?
The one with Hillary Clinton at the Rockefeller Ranch, the one where they met to discuss disclosure of government-held UFO secrets. The book in her hand, Are We Alone? They were meeting on UFOs.
I don't know. Maybe we should go check that out. The organized push for disclosure under the Rockefeller Initiative worked its way through exopolitics, with Washington taking on the question of extraterrestrials. Lawrence Rockefeller wrote to and eventually met with President Clinton in the White House. Rockefeller wrote a memo titled Lifting Secrecy on Information About Extraterrestrial Intelligence, requesting that Clinton review the government policy on this information, pleading that, quote, as our first post-Cold War president, you have an opportunity to take an important step without the national security restraints that may have hindered past presidents from coming clean. Noting the cynicism towards government held by popular culture, Lawrence Rockefeller emphasized the opportunity for a, quote, new spirit of partnership between the government and its citizens. Clinton obliged, writing an Executive Order 12958, which directed that all government records of historical value and those 25 years or older be immediately reviewed and declassified, though national security exceptions remained. Isn't Stephen Greer Rockefeller funded?
Okay, so there, with a little help from Dan and Melissa Dykes, we find out that Dr. Stephen Greer is connected to the Rockefellers. He's also connected to Bill and Hillary Clinton and all that good information there. So, yeah, isn't it odd that Stephen Greer rubbing shoulders with these people, being involved with the Rockefellers, being funded by the Rockefellers with his Disclosure Project, after all this time is now coming out and saying, oh yeah, well the final card is this fake alien invasion, right? So it's just strange. And then I thought I would make this episode as an addendum to the Corbett documentary, because in that episode, it's all made on the premise, everything he says is on the premise that Stephen Greer is not pushing this alien invasion narrative. So why the change? What's the change for? And now we're maybe 45 minutes into this documentary here, and you're asking, well, Patrick, what is Project Bluebeam, right? Okay, well, now that we've set the stage for all of this, let's talk about what the actual etymology of Project Bluebeam is. So Project Bluebeam was a essay that was written by Serge Monast, who is a French-Canadian journalist. And he wrote this in 1994. And he died 2 years later from a heart attack. So he was killed for this, ostensibly. He was killed for unveiling to the world of the final card that NASA had. And things to know about Serge Monast is that he was a Christian. He was a devout Christian, is my understanding. So they were researching Project Bluebeam. Of course, there's no actual documents to back up this claim, but him and another journalist that were researching both died from heart attacks within weeks of each other, although neither had a history of heart disease. So Serge was in Canada. The other Canadian journalist was visiting Ireland. Prior to his death, the Canadian government abducted Serge's daughter in an attempt to dissuade him from pursuing his research into Project Bluebeam, and his daughter was never returned. Also, pseudo heart attacks are one of the alleged methods of death induced by Project Bluebeam. So this is a website, Educate Yourself, Freedom of Knowledge, the Power of Thought. So this is the conspiracy website that still hosts his article. So this is the actual article. So he says, Serge Monast does, the infamous NASA Bluebeam project has 4 different steps in order to implement the New Age religion with the Antichrist at its head. We must remember that the New Age religion is the very foundation for the New World Government, without which religion, the dictatorship of the New World Order is completely impossible. So the first step is engineered earthquakes and hoax discoveries. So he says the first step in the NASA Bluebeam project concerns the breakdown reevaluation of all archaeological knowledge. It deals with the setup with artificially created earthquakes at certain locations on the planet, of supposedly new discoveries which will finally explain to all people the error of all fundamental religious doctrines. The falsification of the information will be used to make all nations believe that their religious doctrines have been misunderstood for centuries and misinterpreted. Psychological preparations for that first step have already been implemented with the film 2001: A Space Odyssey, the Star Trek series, and Independence Day, all of which deal with invasions from space and the coming together of all nations to repel the invaders. The last film's Jurassic Park deals with the theories of evolution and claim God's words are lies. So, I mean, you're getting some pretty rampant speculation here, and nothing really that directly supports this idea that there will be earthquakes at specific locations causing new discoveries. So he talks about the hoax discoveries. But this is maybe the most interesting part of the whole thing, and maybe even the most compelling, because technology for this does exist. He writes, the big space show in the sky is the second step. The second step involves a gigantic space show with three-dimensional optical holograms and sounds, laser projection of multiple holographic images to different parts of the world, each receiving a different image according to predominating regional, national, religious faith. This new God's voice will be speaking in all languages. In order to understand that, we must study various secret services research done in the last 25 years. The Soviets have perfected an advanced computer, even exported them and fed them with the minute psychological particulars based on their studies of the anatomy and electromechanical composition of the human body and the studies of the electrical, chemical, and biological properties of the human brain. These computers were fed as well with the languages of all human cultures and their meanings. The dialects of all cultures have been fed into the computers from satellite transmissions. The Soviets began to feed the computers with objective programs like the ones of the new Messiah. It also seems that the Soviets, the New World Order people, have resorted to suicidal methods with the human society by allocating electronic wavelengths for every person and every society and culture to induce suicidal thoughts if the person doesn't comply with the dictates of the New World Order. And interestingly enough, I'm just thinking of a parallel here. There was that movie that was spoofed in Scary Movie, but it was a movie that I think was a flop, and I don't know if it was by M. Night Shyamalan, but where everyone, like, all of a sudden en masse started committing suicide. It was this movie called The Happening with Mark Wahlberg, and it was a huge flop, but it was an M. Night Shyamalan film that I remember watching. I don't know if any of... Oh, and it had Zooey Deschanel in it? What? Yeah, so I don't know if you guys remember this, but it was a huge kind of flop and kind of a terrible movie, but that's kind of the plot of The Happening. So I don't know, maybe M. Night Shyamalan is in on it. So we have suicidal thoughts being introduced in folks that don't comply. The space show, let's see, the two different aspects of step 2. The first is the space show. Where does the space show come from? The space show, the holographic images, will be used in a simulation of the ending, during which all nations will be shown scenes that will be the fulfillment of that which they desire to verify the prophecies and adversary events. These will be projected from satellites onto the sodium layer about 60 miles above the Earth. We see tests every once in a while, but they are called UFO and flying saucers sightings. The result of these deliberately staged events will be to show the world the new Christ, the new Messiah, Maitreya, for the immediate implementation of the New World religion. Enough truth will be foisted upon an unsuspecting world to hook them into the lie. Even the most learned will be deceived. That's in quotes. The project has perfected the ability for some device, referred to as tractor beams by ufologists, to lift up an enormous number of people, as in a rapture, and whisk the entire group into Never Never Land. We see tests of these devices with the abduction of humans by those mysterious little alien greys who snatch people out of their beds and through windows into waiting motherships, in quotes. The calculated resistance to the universal religion and the new Messiah in the ensuing holy wars will result in the loss of human life on a scale never imagined before in all of human history. The Blue Beam Project will pretend to be the universal fulfillment of the prophecies of old, as major an event as that which occurred 2,000 years ago. In principle, it will make use of the skies as a movie screen, as space-based laser-generating satellites project simultaneous images to the four corners of the planet, in every language and dialect according to the region. It deals with the religious aspect of the New World Order and its deception and seduction on a massive scale. Computers will coordinate the satellites and software already in place. Computers will coordinate the satellites, and software already in place will run the sky show. Holographic images are based on nearly identical signals combining to produce an image or hologram with deep perspective, which is equally applicable to acoustic ELF, VLF, and LF waves and optical phenomenon. Specifically, the show will consist of multiple holographic images to different parts of the world, each receiving a different image according to the specific national regional religion. Not a single area will be excluded, with computer animations and sounds appearing to emanate from the very depths of space. Astonished ardent followers of the various creeds will witness their own returned messiahs in convincing lifelike reality. So this is pretty crazy, man. And like, it's really creepy too. I mean, the idea that this could be true, or the just the prospect of any of this being grounded in reality. But as we're going to explore in just a minute, there are things about this, specific technologies, which seem in some way to make it somewhat plausible. And I'm not saying, for sure this is happening. This is what, because there's nothing really to corroborate these wild speculations that he's making here. And so, but just enough to make it be like, we're just grappling with interesting things here. But this is a terrifying, apocalyptic vision, and just the whole concept of like a faked messiah or a faked alien invasion. He seems to, for him, it's more about the faked messiah, and he seems to think that the alien stuff is all a hoax, or is all faked, or something like that. But specifically with this idea of COVID-19 being such a globally disruptive event, and something that's completely unreal, that no one living now could possibly really conceive or think that something like this would be plausible in the government reactions to it. And all the things that people are bandying about, that like Klaus Schwab and the World Economic Forum, and all these things about health passes, and the World Economic Forum Young Leaders Summit in that group, and all of these policies being unrolled lockstep across the world. It's like all these events make you want to take everything and like see it in a new light, or consider it, because you never would think that what's happening with COVID would ever possibly happen. But then it does happen. And so you want to re-examine things with more of like, I don't know, like entertaining things, and be open-minded about it. So I don't know, like it's almost the sentiment like nothing could surprise me anymore, with everything that's happened in the world. So he talks more about this, saying that this event will occur at a time of profound worldwide political anarchy and general tumult created by some worldwide catastrophe. So, yes, COVID-19, everyone. So naturally, he says this superbly staged falsification will result in dissolved social and religious disorder on a grand scale, each nation blaming the other for the deception, setting loose millions of programmed religious fanatics through demonic possession on a scale never witnessed before. So artificial thought and communication, he talks more about some of the evidence for this that he cites, which I believe is mostly speculative, but I guess it's interesting if this stuff has already really kind of been these technologies have been discovered. So he's saying the U.S. has already developed communications equipment which can make the blind see, the deaf hear, and the lame walk. It can relieve the terminally ill from pain without the use of drugs or surgery. I'm not talking about science fiction. A man might retain the use of all of his faculties right up to the moment of his death. This communications equipment depends on a completely new way of looking at the human brain and neuromuscular systems and radiation pulses at ultra-low frequencies. Some of this equipment is now operational within the CIA and FBI. It will never be used to make the blind see, the deaf hear, and the lame walk because it's central to the domestic political agenda and foreign policy of George Bush and his puppet masters of the New World Order. He talks about research in the 70s, 80s. He was referring to that. In January 1991, the University of Arizona hosted a conference entitled The NATO Advanced Research Workshop on Current and Emergent Phenomena in Biomolecular Systems. What exactly does that mean? It means this. We refer to one paper that was delivered at the conference, which stands out for its different attitude towards the development under discussion at that time. It was, in effect, a protest and chilling warning to the attending scientists about the potential use of their research findings. There's no link to it. I know this was made in the 90s, but there's no link to that. And I wonder if we could even bring that up. Okay, so I just tried to find that document. I couldn't find it. I'm not really surprised. I guess I didn't look super hard, but nothing pulled up on the Google machine. So there's another couple of other steps here that's kind of buried in this this article, but the third step of the NASA Blue Beam project is called telepathic electronic two-way communication. And he's actually citing an article here. So let's see. He says in the December 1980 edition of the U.S. Army Journal, called The Military Review, a column by Lieutenant Colonel John B. Alexander entitled The New Mental Battlefield, Beam Me Up, Spock, provides further insight into the technical capabilities at the disposal of the comptroller. He writes, quote, several examples will demonstrate areas in which progress have been made. The transference of energy from one organism to another, the ability to heal or cause disease to be transmitted over a distance, thus inducing illness or death from no apparent cause, telepathic behavior modification, which includes the ability to induce hypnotic states up to a distance of 1,000 kilometers, have been reported. The use of telepathic hypnosis also holds great potential. This capability could allow agents to be deeply planted with no conscious knowledge of their programming. In movie terms, the Manchurian Candidate lives and does not even require a telephone call. Other mind-to-mind induction techniques are being considered. If perfected, this capability could allow the direct transference of thought via telepathy from one mind or group of minds to a select target audience. The unique factor is that the recipient will not be aware that thought has been implanted from an external source. He or she will believe the thoughts are original. So he says this is exactly what I was talking about. Monast says this in quoting Colonel John B. Alexander. So Lieutenant Colonel John B. Alexander's article continues. If it is possible to feed artificial thought into the multigenic genic field via satellite, the mind control of the entire planet is now possible. An individual's only resistance would be to constantly question the motivation behind their thoughts and not act upon thoughts which they consider to be outside their own ideological, religious, and moral boundaries. Monast says, once again, it is wise to consider how television, advertising, modern education, and various types of social pressure are used to manipulate those boundaries. It has been reported by Lieutenant Colonel Alexander, who said in the summary of his military review article, the information on those kinds of technologies presented here would be considered by some to be ridiculous since it does not conform to their view of reality, but some people still believe the world is flat. Okay, in this part of it, I actually was able to corroborate this part of the article. So if you do a Google search for Alexander, the New Mental Battlefield, Beam Me Up, Spock, you see Military Review, December 1980. Here's a photocopy of the actual article. So this is in Military Review, according to, you can look up, it has all the barcodes on it and everything. And he talks about psychotronics, and he does say that these have been identified already and demonstrated. Psychotronics may be described as the interaction of mind and matter. While the concepts may stretch the imagination of many readers, research in this area has been underway for years, and the possibility for employment as weaponry has been explored. To be more specific, there are weapon systems that operate on the power of the mind and whose lethal capacity has already been demonstrated. And that has a citation, and he actually cites a Russian study right here, if you look. Right there. Louis F. Mayer and J.D. Lamont, Soviet and Czechoslovakian parapsychology research, unclassified, Defense Intelligence Agency, Washington, D.C., 1975, page 58. So he has citations here, and it'd be interesting maybe to do an entire episode on this article, because it seems to be legitimate. So that's one thing we can corroborate from the Project Bluebeam. So again, he says Monast says the telepathic electronic two-way communication is the third step, speaking into people's minds themselves. Then he says universal supernatural manifestations via electronics is the fourth step, and this is maybe the wackiest one. The fourth step concerns the universal supernatural manifestation with electronic means. It contains three different orientations. One is to make mankind believe that an alien invasion is about to occur at every major city on Earth in order to provoke each major nation to use its nuclear weapons in order to strike back. This way, the United Nations Court will require that all those nations which launch nuclear weapons to disarm when the invasion is shown to have been false. And how will the UN know that the invasion was false? Well, they will have staged it, of course. The second is to make the Christians believe that the rapture is going to occur with the supposed divine intervention of an alien off-world civilization coming to rescue Earthlings from a savage and merciless demon. Its goal will be to dispose of all significant opposition to the implementation of the New World Order in one major stroke, actually within hours of the beginning of the Sky Show. The third orientation, so there are three different possibilities, he says, of the fourth step. The third orientation in the fourth step is a mixture of electronic and supernatural forces. The waves used at that time will allow, quote, supernatural forces to travel through optical fibers, coaxial cables, electrical and phone lines in order to penetrate to everyone at once through major appliances. Embedded chips will already be in place. The goal of this deals with global satanic ghosts projected all around the world in order to push all populations to the edge of hysteria and madness, to drown them into a wave of suicide, murder, and permanent psychological disorders. After the night of the thousand suns, worldwide populations will be ready for the new Messiah to reestablish order and peace at any cost, even at the cost of abdication of freedom. And then what's interesting and crazy is that after that, Monast actually talks about things that are really happening right now, which is weird. Just about phasing out of cash and putting people on like an enslavement grid situation with unbanking and stuff. So he says, according to the many reports we have received, we believe that all of this will begin with some kind of world economic disaster. Not a complete crash, but enough to allow them to introduce some kind of in-between currency before they introduce their electronic cash to replace all paper or plastic money. The in-between currency will be used to force anyone with savings to spend or turn in their cash, because they understand that people who have money and are not dependent upon them might be the very ones who will mount an insurrection against them. If everyone is broke, no one can fund a war of any kind. Paper currency will cease to exist. This is one of the first signs. But to implement the worldwide electronic money system, everyone in the world who might have money in the future will have to have a way to transfer money electronically. Keep in mind this was written in the 90s. Before that time, everyone will have spent, before the year 2000, all of their cash cash, reserves, and assets. Everyone has to be 100% dependent upon the council for their existence. To prevent any kind of independence, the New World Order has already implanted microchips in wild animals, birds, fish, etc. Why? They want to make certain that the people who will not accept the New World Order will not be able to hunt or fish anywhere in the world. If they try, they will be tracked and traced by satellites, then hunted down and imprisoned or killed. So he goes on basically saying they are changing laws about religion and psychiatric disorders in order to identify anyone who is potentially threatening to the New World Order. Those who are found defective will be sent to eradication camps where their organs will be harvested and sold to the highest bidders. Those who are not killed outright will be used as slave labor or used in medical experiments. The goal of dictatorship is to control everyone everywhere on the planet ruthlessly and without exception. That's why the new technology being introduced everywhere is a technology for the control of the people. The technology of the 40s and 50s was used to help the people have an easier and more productive life. So the new technology is designed and built to track down and control people everywhere. This technology is being manufactured for a specific purpose, and to refuse to see and recognize that purpose, which is to enslave the entire populations of the world, is to deny the emergence of the Antichrist and the establishment of the New World Order religion and government. If you cannot see, if you cannot learn, if you cannot understand, then you and your family and friends will succumb to the fires of the crematoria that have been built in every state and every major city on earth, but built to deal with you. No one is safe in a totalitarian police state. Let's see, there's actually a link there. Oh, I see. So there's a link to another article on this site that the author has put in talking about crematoria, hidden crematoria on the island of Oahu. So really interesting stuff there. I mean, I hope you guys found that as entertaining as I did. I think the only really like chilling, compelling comparisons is talking about the cashless society, but you know, it doesn't take too much of an imagination to imagine that scenario, and people have been kind of talking about that in conspiracy circles for a long time. The creepy part, I guess, is that we're now seeing it kind of play out, or at least the beginnings of it. And again, no one could imagine, you know, I kind of chuckled at this idea of implanting microchips into animals. I guess no one could have imagined maybe in the 90s that, or even 20 years ago, if you were talking about like vaccine passports or like a digital universal ID passport or a social credit score, that would seem like crazy conspiracy theory even 3 or 4 years ago. And now it's being actively talked about all across the world. So these things are kind of scary, interesting as well. The most compelling part about this, and maybe this is a decent segue, is to get into the technology that was talked about. Some of this technology that he's talking about actually has been talked about and is kind of real. So let's take a look at this video from about the God helmet. And this was on the Learning Channel.
I guess I was sort of in a state of fear where I didn't want to turn around and look.
A very friendly, welcoming feeling at one instance.
I was starting to feel very anxious and very cold. The outlines of a human body, almost complete and total panic. Very visual experiences. One of the first ones.
Here at Laurentian University in Sudbury, Ontario, a team is investigating certain common perceptions of the inner mind.
We'll be taking a baseline recording first.
Right now, they're looking at the electromagnetic brain patterns seen in people having the near-death experience. The research is led by Dr. Michael Persinger.
Basically, at any given time, all experience is due to those portions of the brain that are most metabolically active. If we can simulate that by applying complex, meaningful magnetic fields to the brain, we can also induce those experiences.
This experiment is testing the idea that mystical perceptions and paranormal experiences can be turned on at will, not by hypnosis or shamanic drumming, but by a scientist, stimulating nerve activity in the brain.
So they don't split off. Okay. These machines are not.
The volunteer sits blindfolded in a soundproof chamber. This sensory deprivation allows the mind to focus on electromagnetic patterns transmitted across the brain through this modified crash helmet.
If you feel anything change with the electrodes.
They're able to simulate the exact brain patterns that occur in near-death experiences.
Is that comfortable? Yeah.
Dr. Persinger hopes the research will benefit psychotherapy.
We tried to evoke the fragments that compose the near-death experience and other mystical experiences, such as detachment, feelings of moving through a tunnel, hearing voices, the sense of a presence, usually on the left side. Our major thrust is ultimately to apply this to dealing with things such as psychological depression.
After a while, I remember feeling that there was someone else in the room with me, almost looking over my left shoulder. It was all I could do to not turn my head and want to look.
If you stimulate the deep portions of the temporal lobe, so you can get very, very vivid imagery, and the emotional commitment or the emotional sensation that something is profound, real, cosmically real, and personally significant.
It's a male voice, but it's like really, really far away. As if you can just sort of like catch
a tone you can't really hear. You can tell that it's someone talking. You can distinguish that, but you can't make out any kind of words or anything like that.
What we've been doing recently is generating words as magnetic patterns. And even though the person isn't hearing it through their ears, their brain is interpreting it. So they're actually having fragments of experiences as if they're hearing it when in actual fact it cannot be.
These experiences are so strong, they're utterly real for the person who has them. They can be as profound as a religious conversion, yet we can generate them with a machine. These mind games are beginning to shed their secrets. The scientist becomes the shaman. But what are the limits? What else can people be made to believe?
Well, one thing that's really clear, you can control the person's experiences and they don't know they're being controlled. That's why this technology is a potentially powerful one and has a two-edge to its sword.
As a tool of science, this technology may bring us valuable new understandings of the obscure depths of the human mind. But there's a dark side. In the wrong hands, could it become an instrument of power, a means of oppression? If we're not careful, will mind games one day become mind control?
Okay, so that's really interesting, isn't it? It's very interesting. And that was something that I think a viewer put in the comments below that Corbett Report video. So I also wanted to play another video from the Discovery Channel, which seemed to be of the same vintage. But just in the beginning, we'll get a little bit of a clip it because I'm cognizant of time here. But we'll get a little snippet in the beginning of just what this is exactly. So something a little eerie that you'll see video viewers will see in the beginning.
With ultrascience. War in the 21st century. Some foresee an escalation in super weapons, powerful lasers beamed from satellites, and guns that hurl cosmic forces instead of bullets. Others prepare for the day when super hackers will try to bring nations to their knees with computer viruses. And a chilling new world order where the masters of mind control will become masters of the world.
Okay, yeah, so you kind of get the gist of it there. What they've been talking about, and there's other things in this in Corbett's documentary that he links to as well that make it seem somewhat plausible. Some of these technologies that people have been working on. So, and that's kind of the let's see, the airborne holographic projector in particular is one of them. And James Perloff is someone, I've dropped Keith Knight's interview with James Perloff on this show. But this idea of an airborne holographic projector is something that if you go on military websites actually does exist. So this is from a military website here. Brief description. The holographic projector displays a three-dimensional visual image in a desired location, removed from the display generator. The projector can be used for psychological operations and strategic perception management. It is also useful for optical deception and cloaking, providing a momentary distraction when engaging an unsophisticated adversary. So this is something that exists, and there are white papers that deal with this.
The Morrises are experts in non-lethal weapons technology. They are consultants to the Defense Department, CIA, NSA, and world-renowned think tanks.
The technology necessary to project three-dimensional images to a point in space requires no new breakthroughs in science. We have the technology now.
Overall, the non-lethal weapons development program is aimed at giving our military options between talking and shooting.
Specific system development, we really can't talk about.
But the Morrises did talk in general about secret military experiments with lifelike 3D projections in the sky called holograms.
Holograms on a battlefield would be to divert the attention of the enemy, to deliver propaganda or something very frightening to make the enemy run away if you think that he will believe that what you're sending is really an angel, a devil, a UFO.
And where could this type of weaponry be tested? Perhaps not coincidentally, along the US-Mexico border at the Army's electronic proving ground in Fort Huachuca, Arizona.
Keep in mind that test facilities like Fort Huachuca in Arizona are electrical optical test beds, and part of what they're testing are the effects of these electro-optical devices on a target population.
And the target population may be us.
America has to test American equipment in America.
The ultimate weapon in the info war would be so secret, so invisible, so undetectable, you would never know your mind was under attack. At Laurentian University in Ontario, Canada, a young student is about to undergo one of the strangest experiences of her life. They're hooking Denise's brain up to an electroencephalograph, or EEG machine. For 30 to 40 minutes, this will monitor her brainwaves, while these electric coils attached on either side of her head will immerse her brain in an electromagnetic field. Her brain actually completes the circuit between the two coils. The field pulsing through her brain is less powerful than one given off by a digital clock radio, but acutely controlled and focused at specific parts of the brain, it will open Denise's mind to outside suggestion by this man.
We're going to do a switch and see if it's right left hemisphere.
Dr. Michael Persinger is a professor of psychology and neuroscience. He is designing ways to put the power of mind control to good use.
So there you can see the work of Dr. Persinger is also, he's on TLC, he's on Discovery Channel. At some point in the 90s, they had a field day with him, apparently. And interestingly enough, some of the other more compelling evidence for this idea of a fake alien invasion also comes from Dr. Stephen Greer. In his documentary, they do cite some things that, at least on the outset, seem to have some kind of veracity to them.
We have these technologies. They are being used in false flag operations where they hoax events. And the purpose for all of that is a sort of psychological warfare, as it says in the CIA document I have, the director of the CIA saying the UFO subject is very valuable for psychological warfare potential. And that is a very interesting thing to be written in 1953, right? And what does that really mean? Well, it means that the long-term defense strategy from the late 40s and 50s forward was informed by eventually using this last card to consolidate sort of a global, totalitarian military control of the population.
Could it be manipulated purposely by people who have the technology to simulate UFO sightings? And people say, well, of course not. Who would do a thing like that? Well, I would remind you that during the Watergate investigation, it was discovered that there was a plan originated in the White House to surface a submarine off the coast of Cuba and paint the second coming of Christ over the island of Cuba using holograms. Which is well within our technology today. The idea was that since there is a large Catholic population in Cuba, they would be so upset by this vision that this would saturate the communication channels, the telephone system in Cuba, long enough for an invasion to take place.
How interesting. I never heard of that.
Well, I think that's a classic in psychological warfare, but that kind of manipulation is well understood. And I have personally investigated several apparently genuine UFO cases where there was in fact manipulation. My conclusion, the conclusion of scientists working with me, was that there was in fact a manipulation taking place and that it was not a hoax on the part of the witnesses, but a hoax on the part of somebody much better organized than them.
In Vallee's book, Forbidden Science 4, he describes a smoking gun document that confirms what Doty said. In an entry dated Thursday, 26th of March, 1992, Vallee writes, "I have secured a document confirming that the CIA simulated UFO abductions in Latin America as psychological warfare experiments. We reached out to Dr. Vallee and asked him if we could publish the document in this film. He refused and tried to blame the producers of this film for his decision to not release it. Unfortunately, others in the UFO research community have similar evidence of this cosmic false flag, but are afraid to come forward publicly. This lack of courage or integrity, or both, is precisely why the secrecy persists."
So in summing up the evidence for this Project Bluebeam scenario, we talked about that 1980 document that was actually cited in the original Project Bluebeam article by Serge Monast. We have corroborated that that article at least exists. Maybe it's fake, maybe it's all BS, Army PSYOP kind of situation. However, it did talk about the mind control being something that's been verified and something that is has been demonstrated. We talked about the implants or at least the electromagnetic waves at that Canadian university being something that they were able to do with that psychiatrist. So we've talked about those things. We've talked about how holographic projectors, there's some evidence to support that. But I mean, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention at least the Tupac hologram that was at Coachella just a few years ago. And so you get some image here of the actual hologram of Tupac that they projected on stage. And I hope I'm not misunderstanding. My understanding was that they literally projected him onto the stage, but I don't know if it could be something like a TV screen or something like that, but you can see the actual hologram of him. So we have these assertions that this technology exists, but then we have actual situations where it has been implemented. And another thing that I found really interesting were these strange humming sounds that were occurring across the world. Now, I don't think this is compelling or anything, and I'm sure there's like a legitimate explanation for it, but some kind of incident like this you would imagine would be happening in the Project Bluebeam scenario. So I don't know if anyone's seen or heard these videos before, but a few years ago there were these videos taken of these strange humming sounds across the world. So this is what it sounds like.
People have been recording strange noises like this one in Kiev for some time now. Videos filmed all over the world have appeared on YouTube, the first in summer last year. But no one's really sure what they're hearing. Speculation ranges from cloaked UFOs to military testing, to experiments by HAARP, a US research project that studies the ionosphere. But Nick Pope, who used to investigate UFOs for the MOD, reckons something more down to earth is to blame.
One possibility is that we're dealing with some sort of atmospheric phenomenon involving thunder, but sound can behave in very funny ways, and that's one option.
All right, so all those things aside, it's really interesting. It's just an interesting situation, and it's undeniable that planted in the consciousness, the public consciousness, is this idea of aliens invading, and an alien invasion causing the nations of the world to forget their problems and to band together into some kind of mutual defense. And we have these compelling connections between this idea of like a simulated alien invasion. We have people who are connected to the Rockefellers like Stephen Greer and the U.S. Like intelligence community and Dr. Werner von Braun. We have these connections with this idea of a faked alien invasion. But I guess to throw some cold water on it as we're closing up here, I wanted to return to Richard Dolan. And I'm finishing here, and like I don't have any more time to do this episode tonight. I would have liked to include more information from Richard Dolan because I think he has some really good takes on it. But to get all that information and the connections out there, I just wanted to bookend with him, although I would have liked to have said more. But let's go to an article that he wrote called Project Bluebeam Countdown, Don't Bet on It. So in 2010, he wrote this piece. According to the latest flurry of internet rumors, Project Bluebeam is supposed to take place on Wednesday, October 13th, 2010. This is said to be a false flag operation in which an alien invasion scenario is undertaken in order to create a one-world global police state. I am not sure who originated this latest rumor, nor why the date of October 13, 2010 was selected. Perhaps it was this person. I do not know. I do know, however, that the claims for Project Bluebeam were first made in 1994 by Serge Monast, a Quebecois Canadian. And who's this person? Retired NORAD officer's new book predicts a tentative worldwide UFO display on October 13, 2010. Let's see. Stanley A. Fulham, a retired Air Force officer, released this book predicting the invasion to take place that day. But anyways, Richard Dolan goes on and says, the death of Serge Monast. Monast argued that NASA and the UN were working together to implement a New Age religion and a start of a new world order with the Antichrist as its head. He only got the chance to make this claim for a few years because in late 1996 he died under circumstances that to some people around him seemed suspicious. So that's a picture of him, actually. His Wikipedia entry states that by 1995 and 96 he claimed he was being hunted by the police and authorities for involvement in, quote, networks of prohibited information. He had homeschooled his two children, who were then taken away and made wards of the state in September 96 so that they would receive education. He died of a heart attack in his home in December 96 at age 51, the day after being arrested and spending a night in jail. Let's see. It is possible that clandestine weaponry induced Monast's fatal heart attack. After all, heart attack creating capabilities have been with us for some time, says Richard Dolan. However, we must also at least acknowledge the other viable alternative, that Monast simply died. He was living under extraordinary stress. He had not only lost custody of both of his children, but had recently been incarcerated. Prior to that, he had been a political activist for many years, nor did he look especially healthy based on the few photos I have seen of him. Men do die of heart attacks at age 51. It happens. Indeed, it has been claimed not only that he was killed in this manner, but also another journalist who was also researching Project Bluebeam within weeks of Monast's death. The other journalist was said to be Canadian too and was in Ireland at the time. However, the name of this other person is not given in any of the articles I have found. More vagaries. But these are peripheral issues. Why did Monast say, or what did he say about Blue Beam, and what evidence did he present for it? False flags do occur. Dolan talks about Operation Northwoods here. If you don't know, it's a 1962 program called Operation Northwoods, called for the CIA or other operatives to commit acts of terrorism inside the U.S. and elsewhere, which would then be blamed on Cuba and would justify a U.S. invasion of the island. Kennedy rejected the Northwoods proposal, but the plan itself shows that operations in the clandestine world had no compunction against lying or killing their own citizens in order to push a certain agenda. Then he talks about Gulf of Tonkin, concluding that no attack by North Vietnamese boats took place against the U.S. during that night. So what he wrote then, he said he went through the 4 stages, which we have already kind of talked about. And he says, let's see, he included a long passage that we've already read to get a whiff of the mind of this man, a woof. Very intense. He has no understanding of science, says Richard Dolan, and at no point in any of his writings is anything like evidence offered for any of this, to say nothing of the fantastic capabilities he attributes to NASA or to the United Nations. No support for that. Now, there are deeply classified elements in our world that have truly exotic technology at their disposal. The answer is a resounding yes, but Monast here offers no support for any of his prophecy. For instance, how to pull off the earthquake scenario. Even if you posit the existence of earthquake-creating weapons, debatable, but let us keep as open as possible, you still have to have the archaeological evidence perfectly positioned and perfectly manufactured to be persuasive to the world, to say nothing of the archaeologists themselves, who would surely, you would think they would protest unless they were in on it. The logistics of the various sky shows also seem daunting, to say the least. First, there's the false alien invasion scenario. Presumably, this could be done with a fleet of black triangles, although could they blanket the world? Doubtful. But then, regarding the religious fakery, are they really going to blanket the world with holographic images of what? God, Jesus, Krishna, Allah? All the while sending a message into our brains via extra low frequencies in all languages of the world, all in a way that convinces us to abandon our previously held faiths. It's clear that he was a millenarian Christian. Here's a 1994 presentation by him, which states the goals of NASA's Blue Beam. So rather than make a case for the existence of Project Blue Beam, Monast preferred to discuss its satanic agenda. He was clearly more at home focusing on the New Age conspiracy going back through such writers as Helena Blavatsky, Alice Bailey, Nicholas Roerich, and David Spangler, the foundation as he saw it of the Luciferian New World Order. So he was more about how he was Christian. No evidence and no logic. Dolan says that was Monast, and that was way back in 94, you might say. Although he did not offer a precise prediction for Blue Beam's implementation, he seemed to suggest it would happen around the year 2000. Other people have written about Blue Beam since his death, and other dates have come and gone since then, all of which were supposed to be Blue Beam events. Now it's supposed to be Wednesday the 13th. Forgive me if I fail to run for cover. He says nearly all the writing on Blue Beam today is derivative of Monast's writing. No one has offered anything original except to downplay the Christian element of it and to mix in some new technologies like HARP to make it sexier. But even the connections to HARP do nothing more than to offer speculations. No research, nothing tangible. None of these sites offer anything resembling evidence to support the alleged existence of Blue Beam. I'm not asking for proof, only evidence, and I see nothing. In general, over the years, I've had a problem with the concept of a Blue Beam type of scenario, that is, something in which the New World Order is created by causing a fake alien invasion or a fake second coming of Christ. Regarding the staged alien invasion, I have just never seen the logic. Most of the people promoting the notion don't believe in what I would consider to be true UFOs. That is, they don't believe in extraterrestrials and generally don't argue that all UFO sightings are of deep black, completely man-made origin. Some of them even argue that alleged gray aliens are programmable life forms, or PLFs, artificial beings created by black ops, although no evidence is offered for this contention. In my own assessment, all of those who have argued for the fake alien invasion scenario have displayed great ignorance of the history of UFOs. The staged alien invasion scenario only makes sense if you don't believe in UFOs other than as black ops ruse. If you believe as I do that there are real UFOs, then it seems wholly illogical. I'm also deeply skeptical of the faked second coming or heavenly arrival scenario. To put it mildly, there are many religions in this world. Monast did claim that the Blue Beam operation would be designed to speak to the various religious belief systems of the world. I, for one, would love to know how that would be done. How to persuade Christians of countless individual persuasions, Muslims, Hindus, and the billions of non-religious people in the world that God has arrived in the sky. Now, we did talk about beaming into people's mind, and we did present kind of some evidence, I guess, of this situation of mind directing through this Canadian researcher, this university, this psychiatrist. So, and Monast did say that. We went through that in his article. Is that conclusive proof or any kind of compelling evidence? It's speculation, you know. But there is, I mean, he did offer that one article by the Army officer as some kind of a support. But so maybe that's a contention we could make with Dolan's analysis. But he said, I'd love to go back over the last 10, 20 years and make a list of all the predictions that have littered the field of UFOs and alternative culture in general. An alien armada has passed Pluto and is headed for Earth, yada, yada, yada. He says there are bad people with a preponderance of power in our world, and there are false flag operations afoot. We must be aware, vigilant, and ready to oppose them, but we also need to do this intelligently. We need to gather evidence. We need to make a case. Although I am so tired of encountering other people's predictions, I love offering my own. Ready? Here it is. Project Bluebeam will not take place on Wednesday, October 13th, 2010. It could be that all this advanced publicity scared off the planners, or maybe it's just because Project Bluebeam does not exist. So, going back as well, there's another article. Let's see. Project Bluebeam Exposed, written Wednesday, November 3rd, 2010. This is, I think, secretsun.blogspot.com. I think it's someone who follows Richard Dolan's work because he cites it here. In what this guy does in his article, he talks about Dolan's contentions with it, but then he highlights how Monast's predictions are regurgitated Star Trek scripts. And so this guy goes through and points out exactly in this blog post how Monast's Project Bluebeam essay, if you will, was plagiarized from scripts of Star Trek episodes, which detailed out exactly the predictions that he was making. So in this article, he has links to the exact Star Trek episodes with screenshots and with timestamps and everything, where Monast would have possibly gotten the theory for this. And a lot of these episodes came out in the 90s, so it would have happened just a couple years before Serge Monast wrote his piece on Project Bluebeam. So I thought that was really interesting, kind of funny. Although I will say that, I guess as a counter to that, if we go back to that video that we were watching with TrueStream Media, in there, the second half of the video is talking about how the X-Files writers actually had connections to the intelligence community. And I'd leave everyone to actually watch this themselves. But they do talk about the connection to the intelligence community and how it's well known that the CIA was feeding episode ideas to the X-Files. And just that it's well known as well that Hollywood has, like the intelligence community has a desk where they review and approve or deny Hollywood scripts, or where they give incentives for Hollywood to include certain things in their movies or to have a certain bent, and that there's an incentive structure there. So yeah, I mean, a lot of information that I went through here, and I think this episode ended up being a bit longer than I intended. But again, if I could go back, I would include more of Richard Dolan's work, because he does have really good work. And I think that, like, maybe as a final takeaway here, I believe as Richard Dolan does, I think, and I would side with Corbett, that, you know, it is interesting that there is this narrative about an alien invasion. I think it is interesting to think about and to kind of ponder why exactly Stephen Greer, with his connections, would be publicizing this invasion, this fake alien invasion narrative, especially knowing that he has connections in the intelligence community, knowing that he has been tangentially, well, directly related with this Lawrence Rockefeller, and with the Clintons, that he's had phone calls with Bill Clinton, claims to have been briefing presidents on the UFO issue. And so it's just suspicious and weird and strange that he would come up now with this documentary talking about a fake alien invasion. So I think there's enough there that at least you can speculate about things, and there's some evidence that would make it seem like this is a somewhat compelling situation, and maybe something that we just should keep in mind and be on the watch for. Maybe not making crazy predictions about this is definitely going to happen, but more so be in the skeptical camp of well, this wouldn't surprise me. And at this point, with everything happening with COVID, nothing would really surprise me anymore. So taking a look at this, looking at the connections with this specific narrative, that people in positions of power are actually talking about this, and I don't know, just knowing it exists and keeping a skeptical eye. So I hope that you guys enjoyed this. This was the first time I've talked about aliens on the show, and I guess I'm a little self-conscious coming out with this because of the crazy subject matter, but I tried to stay grounded, and I hope that you guys appreciate that. But try to stay grounded in evidence, and say when we're speculating, and not just make wild claims or run with certain narratives. So, all right, well, that will be everything from me. There was no mid-roll in this episode, so please do go check out, if you like the work that I'm doing, if you do appreciate it, head on over to libertyweekly.net/resources, and or support, either support or resources. I think it's support. Head on over there. You can see all the ways to support me. Please subscribe on Odyssey, ODYSEE, libertyweekly.net/Odyssey. I'm about to break 1,100 followers on Odyssey. I really do appreciate that. And that's where I prefer that people go and subscribe there. If you like the work that I do, go on over to patreon.com. There's a whole bunch of stuff there. There's a PayPal link on the support page on the website. So just explore all those options. And if you like the work I do, please encourage me to help doing it. So that'll be all. Thanks, guys. Peace.